Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Thank you so much for having me here. It is an honor to be with you all today and a surprise. I would never have thought leading a webinar on radical Dharma would have led to a keynote at this conference, and so it's just a real treat to be able to be here. I think I got this right. Good. Yes. So, is this okay? Can people hear me all right? All right, so we're going to do a kind of mashup of the many things that I do. Some of it is kind of traditional lecture style, some of it is participatory, some of it is practice-based, and that's because that's really where I live. I live at the intersections of academia, Dharma, social justice, and I infuse them all with abolition. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how all of those things inform each other, particularly in the ways that I bring radical Dharma and contemplative practices to my classroom and to campuses. And so hopefully we'll get a chance to learn with each other a little bit today. So first of all, did anyone recognize the song that I was playing earlier? Some of you, yeah. Well, when I first started thinking about this talk, and see, if I get too far from my script, I will lose all the things. So first of all, I want to thank you all for being here. I know that there are other things that you could be doing. There's no other place I would rather be, but that doesn't mean that's true for you. And so as the song says, I'd like to extend special thanks to the conference committee, especially Care for introducing me, and Stephanie Briggs and Maya for making all these incredible arrangements, not just for me, but for the entire conference, managing so many egos and schedules and relationships and details to make this conference a place of ease and enrichment and connection. So this song came to mind as I was preparing for this talk, because in my youth in the 90s, before I found my sitting practice, before I found my teachers, I had to find my way. And part of what I was doing was just drawing from media, drawing from the teachers that were all around me in order to know what time it was, to know what matters, to know what I'm supposed to do with my life. And this idea that we need to focus on being right here, right now, and that we need to wake up from history in order to do it, did not necessarily make sense to me when I was 14, but there's a reason it came back to me now. In this moment, in this time, in order to be present, in order to be right here, right now, we have to wake up to the history that we have inherited. And that is one of the hardest reality checks for many of us, because we've been asleep. Many of us have been able to be present in ways that absent the reality of history. And so a lot of the work that I do, a lot of the work that we're doing in Radical Dharma is to be right here, right now, with our whole selves. And so I was going to start with a bit of a centering practice, just so we can see what that feels like in ourselves in this moment. So if you can start by just finding your feet. Getting that connection with the ground that supports us, that holds everything that is. Sending that taproot of ourselves down through the floor, connecting with the ground below, the foundation. Then in-breath. And on the out-breath, find your seat. The center of gravity. supporting your body, allowing the air to flow unrestricted as you're able. Finding your feet, find your seat, and find your length. Putting the crown of your head in parallel to the sky. And feeling your inherent dignity. Inherent because it can't be taken away. It was given to you at birth. And allow the in-breath. And on the out-breath, find your width. Rolling the shoulders up to your ears and letting them cascade back. Opening your chest up. Broadening into relation. First with yourself. Exposing your heart. Deepening into that relationship, we can extend further into relationship with those on either side of us. With that rootedness and that length and that width, allow an in-breath. And on the out-breath, find your depth. And drop into your core. Sitting at the core of what really matters. That place, that thing that you return to time and again. It's just what matters for right now. For right now. Take refuge in it. Let it welcome you home. And take a few breaths just to deepen into this space and this time of holding what really matters at the center of our attention. Can bring the practice to a close by bringing your palms together, or however you like to bring your practice to a close, just sealing it. So today's talk is about time, about taking the time that we need to center into what really matters in the midst of everything else. So just take a moment to notice if anything came up for you, what if anything came up for you during the centering practice. If there's anything you noticed about your body or your breath or your mind. And if anyone would like to share, I wonder if there's anyone who could grab the mic and run, be a runner. Thank you. Thank you. If you could say your name and pronoun.
Hi, I'm Caroline. My pronouns are she, her, hers. This is probably, whatever the third or fourth centering that I've done today, and I was super restless, in this one, and it was much more difficult for me, for whatever reason, I guess. In the morning, I guess nothing has happened yet, and so centering is very simple for me. At the end of the day, when lots of stuff has happened, it was a lot more fizzy.
Thank you for that. I can relate. Can anyone relate to this? Yes. That's why it's so beautiful to have early morning practice. Just a clear space, setting the tone for the day. Somehow getting to the cushion later on is challenging. It's quite challenging. Does anyone else want to share? Thank you.
What really worked, or I've done this practice before from Reverend Angel's video on YouTube. And what really changed this time felt like using the word find. Find your length, find your width, as opposed to what I'm used to, which was feel into or breathe into. But the word finding had this sense of urgency, it was missing. That felt different because it was missing. There are moments where I'm not present and I'm not feeling into everything. So thank you for using that word.
Thanks for sharing. There is a period of time when I was working with Reverend Angel. Yeah, and we'll take one more. There was a period of time when I was working with Reverend Angel while I was in graduate school. And graduate school, I'd lost my mind. I was completely in my head. I just came by to find my feet. And they were in the middle of a yoga teacher training. And they were like, oh, perfect. Will you just be our student for the next day, for the next few hours? And I was like, okay, perfect. 10 hours later, it was as if I had a new body. I didn't even realize I'd been living in this much of myself. And just being able to breathe into my full self gave me a whole new range of options. And not just for choices in what to do, what to eat, how to hold myself, who to talk to, what to indulge with, right? But also how to think. The thoughts, the stories that can enter your head and rule your life when you're in a contracted space of stress are just limited. And the more time you give yourself to feel into, find your body, find your feet, find your seat, find your inherent dignity, actually gives you more space to think different thoughts and to be in a different way with yourself, be in a different relationship with yourself. We have one more sharing.
Hi, I'm Jill. I use she, her pronouns. You just did with your body, that word that I was thinking in my head was space. And so one of the things that I was feeling as I was doing this practice just a few moments ago was just that all these people in this room right now did that together. So there was this sort of collectivism in finding our space, right? And that even though the practice may not have felt, you may not feel any different, even though you may have been like over here in your head doing that practice, what I love about the fact that we're all doing this together together in this time and in this space is just that we are allowing ourselves the space and the time to do this. So thank you.
Thank you for that. How many of you spend time paying attention to the thing that really matters that you were centering on a regular basis? Yeah, regular basis? For how many of you, that's pretty good. We got a pretty, okay, cool. For how many of you was it like, oh right, this thing, I should probably spend a little bit more time with this? I know that's me all the time, yes. And for how many of you was it a surprise? Like, oh, I didn't realize this really matters, but here it is, and I don't get to give it enough time or attention. Anyone? We're all, thank you. Thank you for your honesty. I've done this practice so many times, and I am always surprised what comes up for me in terms of what really matters. And sometimes it's familiar, and I'm like, oh, right, that, the stepdaughter. Yes, I am very concerned with her, right? Sometimes it's something that I did not see coming, like grief. Like, I do not spend a lot of time on my grief, right? And because I don't, in that moment when I was able to sink in and see, oh, this actually really matters to you, I was able to start to shift my life and my priorities to say, how can I make more time for this? What is actually getting in the way? How am I organizing what really matters in ways that actually don't align with what really matters in my body? Not in my head, not on my life planner, not in the scope of my professional development or in the expectations of me, but in my body, what really matters and how am I centering it and taking refuge in it as a daily practice in my daily life? How is it reorganizing my priorities and what it means to feel at home? A lot of the, now I can't do it. We haven't gone to the next slide. Oh, no, we don't want to hear the song again. There we go. This is actually what was supposed to be up while we were doing our centering into presence exercise, but this is a anthem, rallying cry. We have nothing to lose but our chains, that comes to us from Assata Shakur and has been turned into a rallying cry by Black Lives Matter. And it's one that resonates with me on a political level, on a spiritual level. The idea that there is nothing to lose by prioritizing what really matters to us, but our chains, is revolutionary. And it requires a practice of telling time quite differently than that way that we've learned to practice time in our daily lives. Oh, no, I don't have time to put down my chains. I gotta get to the store, I gotta take care of the kid, I gotta go to, I got deadlines. Chains? These are fine, don't worry. It's actually not that bad. I'm okay. What time is it? How are we keeping track of time? Or is time keeping track of us? Are we centering into what really matters as a daily practice of discernment, of being in choice? Or are we just trying to beat the clock? One of the big questions at the center of prophetic praxis, there are 5 radical Dharma. We're going to get to radical Dharma in a little bit, but radical Dharma has 5 practices, 5, they're called the big 5 pillars of freedom. Frameworks for liberation, that's what it's called. We debated a lot of different things. Precepts, pillars, framework. I think we settled on framework because it's the most secular. So there's 5 radical Dharma steps in the framework for liberation. And number 4 is prophetic praxis. And for me, prophetic praxis, understanding what prophecy means, is really about being able to tell time according to what is most important to you right now, right? So how do we know what time it is? Most people are just like, oh, well, I'm looking at the clock, I'm checking my date, I'm, scheduling things according to my 5-year plan, right? Part of what I really want us to think hard about is how we know what we think we know about what time is. Who's telling us what the timetable is? Who says who's on time or who's behind or who needs to catch up? These aren't just kind of metrics of productivity that we've inherited from capitalism. They're actually even deeper than that. So time is often understood as this notion of progress, going from beginning, middle to end, a teleology, right? And so I was talking about teleology in my class with my students the other day, and of course they said, what's teleology mean? I was like, oh, that's such a great question. Teleology comes from the Greek word telos, and telos in ancient Greek means end or completion, right? And it means end or completion because in ancient Greek, time was cyclical. Before there was empire, there were cycles. There were seasons, there were life cycles of people, of places, relationships to harvest, right? Until there was a different kind of time. We're getting the technology down. When time became a construct of empire with the Roman Empire, it became important for time to be linear, right? So that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if there's a beginning and a middle and an end, then we have to really focus on that beginning. What is our origin story? We have Romulus and Remus, we have the Washington founding fathers, we have all of these different stories of founding that we return to again and again. And why do we return to these stories? Because they remind us that we're on a trajectory, a teleological determinism that's going to propel us from this prophetic moment in the past into a promised future, right? And then when you get to Christianity, teleology takes on a whole new trajectory, one of ascent, one where we're not just starting from a beginning and moving to a middle and heading towards this prophetic end. There's this idea of going towards something that requires moral conduct, right? There's ethics thrown into the equation. So we're not just moving on a flat line of linear progress. What we do matters, and how we affect the people around us can create the probability of a second coming, of the rapture, if you're so inclined, right? And if you start to think about it, every single kind of understanding of change that we have inherited is mapped onto this trajectory of ascent. I started from the bottom, now I'm here, as Drake says, right? Some of you might not get that reference. That's totally okay. But it's like the Cinderella story. It's the makeover story. The kind of awkward person who comes into high school without any friends or without any familiars, and then someone finds them, gives them a makeover, and all of a sudden they're the most popular kid in school. Right? Again and again, we have these before and after stories that are all about a trajectory of ascent that had an awful beginning, a transformative middle, and a salvific end, right? So many stories of change are then collapsed into this single master narrative of how things change. For some things, that really works. For other things, it really doesn't, without any. For things like trauma, for things like loss, racism is not something that has an ugly end, a transformative middle, and a salvific end in our experience, because the injuries, the infractions, the infection is ongoing. And so what do you do when time doesn't follow the trajectory of ascent that allows us to look back on the past and say, we've come so far? It actually requires us waking up to history and being right here, right now, and saying, that was not my fault, but it is my responsibility. It's my responsibility to center into what matters right now and do something different on account of what I've inherited. It flies in the face of a lot of our conditioning around individual responsibility and individual like pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, because it means that my future, my success, is bound up in those who came far before me and those who will come far after. So part of the attenuation to time is really about beginning to deconstruct the ways that we've inherited the practice of telling time as something that's singular, one master narrative, and consider how it might be multiplicitous. Consider how there might be multiple temporalities operating at the same time, and how do we hold those multiple temporalities? How do we act out of a knowledge of those temporalities? Well, you do it every day. You have an understanding of yourself inside as somebody who is ready for certain things and not ready for others, and you're constantly navigating the absolute and relative truth of the multiplicities of time that you encompass in your individual selves. So often we think that we're telling time, but really it's telling us. It's telling us when to rise, when to work, and for how long. When time isn't telling us what to do and when to do it, we're clocking others, policing the time they took to turn right. That's me a lot of the time. Oh my God, why are you taking so long? To show up, to say sorry. We ask each other when we're gonna pop the question. When are you going to have children? When are you going to retire? The ways that we tell time can run us down, burn us out, keep us deferring, paying attention to what really matters until it might be too late. So telling time is a practice that we learn from listening to rumors, to stories, the media, teachers, parents, professionalization, socialization, citizenship. We mark time with rites of passage, benchmarks, hoop jumping, ladder climbing, trend keeping up with the Joneses or the Kardashians or whoever is the aspirational family of the day. We crowd surf, we face save, and we're turning over backwards to keep up and find ourselves falling behind, feel ourselves leaving behind what really matters. Time telling is a practice that keeps some of us so busy trying to get ahead we cannot see how many others of us are just struggling to survive. So knowing how we know what we know about what time is matters, because sometimes the times are telling us, don't stop, or you won't matter. In college, a lot of what we learn, or what I teach, has to do with the fact that our identities are not our own. Race and gender are social constructions. And the students are finding that, yes, even their conditioning is conditioned. And within all that, though, there is a sense of something beyond identity, something enduring, something where that relative truth of you meets the absolute truth of being right here and right now. As Reverend Angel said in a recent Facebook post, if you're tired of living a hand-me-down life, get instructions to give permission to yourself to be you. So this is what we're up to. Protocols for decolonizing our practice of telling time and making space to center what really matters in real time. It's not convenient. It's not easy, and it requires a collective. It requires a sangha. It requires a community to keep us accountable. So a lot of those that I learned how to tell time from are long gone. There are folks who passed on to us a practice of time telling that breaks with the times. We call these folk prophets. They felt who they were being conditioned to be was so far from who they knew themselves to be and who they could become that they stopped trying to fit in, keep their heads down, bodies, hearts, minds, in time with that time, and went rogue. They became fugitives. They made choices that made more freedom and more choices for us today. So I teach a class called Abolitionist Theory, a prophetic praxis of liberation. And each text that we read is about introducing the students to someone who made choices that refused to capitulate to the times and instead made room for alternative relationships to the present. Choices that not only change the future, but also change their relationship to the past. So I'm going to read a little bit from a section from a paper that I'm working on about what abolition is. This is all like really distracting here. Okay. These are the abolitionists. So before abolition animated an end to our social reliance on prisons and policing, before abolitionists began to reimagine public safety towards this end, before the mass organization of popular dissent mobilized the anti-slavery cause across color lines under the banner of abolition, before it was a rallying cry, abolition was a word rooted in the language of the law. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, abolition is related to the 15th century Middle French word abolir, and I don't speak French, apologies, meaning to destroy, annul, or revoke by means of legal decision. Digging a bit deeper, we find a more poetic meaning of the classical Latin abolissare, meaning that which causes something to shrivel up or wilt, to vanish, disappear, be forgotten. Taking away its prefix at the core of its Latin root, we find the word alesco, which means to grow. In their co-authored introduction to Futures of Black Radicalism, Gay Teresa Johnson and Alex Lubin describe abolition as a politics concerned with, quote, the destruction of racial regime and racial capitalism. The fact that abolitionist campaigns, movements against slavery, lynching, and segregation in prisons all target some expression of racism is a point made in the opening chapter of Angela Davis's foundational prison text, Are Prisons Obsolete? In this text, Davis argues that, quote, the prison reveals congealed forms of anti-Black racism that operate in clandestine ways, rarely recognized as racist. The series of books, advocates, and campaigns abolitionists have animated since constitute an arsenal of practices, both practical protocols of dissent from politics as usual and ways to peer past the blind spots of the present and into prophetic imaginations of the future without prisons. Rather than simply seeking to redeem, eclipse, or overcome the injuries and loss of racial capitalism, abolitionists hold the present accountable to alternative interpretations of the past that deconstruct and reframe so-called common sense orientations to being right here, right now. Revealing the truth of things as they are, the racist propaganda that has passed as history, and the limited dreams of freedom that history has chained to imaginations of what's to come. So rather than ride the wave of mainstream understandings of safety, belonging, and progress, abolition asks us to move like salmon swimming upstream. Abolition asks us to run en masse against the rough currents of whitewater rapids to spawn, risking our lives to move closer to freedom so the next generation can survive. Abolition is not just about winning, legibility, recognition, or status. It's a radical tradition of telling historical time against the current moment. It is a political theory of freedom that can only be realized in practice as a collective, moving towards freedom, in the rough waters of collective trial, error, improvisation, and uncertainty. Old familiar protocols of survival wilt away, fall away in its wake. So many ways of living, so other new ways of living can take root. It is a politics animated by the willful and illicit congregation of fugitive bodies. It is a political project, but political change is not its only aim. Like the Yoruba Orisha of Change Oya, abolition's aim is a destructive clearing that makes room for vibrant new growth, a provisional imposition of the impossible that momentarily unseats our attachments and expectations and shakes us awake to the truth that whatever time we thought it was, that time was always already bound to end. The people, the prophets that walk us through a totally different orientation to time have left us breadcrumbs, testimonies, appeals, confessions, narratives. It is incumbent upon us to return to these artifacts of our own freedom, to understand how folks got free before we found what this is that we are living in, and learn from them. So this is what I do in the class. We read David Walker. Do people familiar with David Walker's appeal? We got one. Oh yeah, there's a bunch of slides that I didn't use. Okay. We have David Walker's appeal. So in 1829, David Walker wrote a incredibly incendiary piece of abolitionist manifesto. It was a call to arms to Black folks to get ready to become fugitive and get ready for freedom. It was a call to white folks to let folks go or suffer the consequences. It was unapologetic, fire and brimstone, and incredibly incendiary, to the point where its circulation resulted in incredible amounts of repression of enslaved people's ability to read, criminalizing literacy. One of the things that, let's see. Oh, that's still there. Okay. One of the things that he says in the appeal is that there is great work for you to do, as trifling as some of you may think of it. You have to prove to the Americans and the world that we are men and not brutes, as we have been represented and by millions treated. Remember to let the aim of your labors among your brethren, and particularly the youths, be the dissemination of education and religion. The class goes all the way from the re-educating call to arms of David Walker's appeal to the colored peoples of the world in 1829. And it's important to note that he was killed the next year under unknown circumstances. All the way to radical Dharma. And before we get to radical Dharma, we do the student struggle for ethnic studies, because I think it's really important for the students to understand that they too are part of this prophetic praxis of liberation, and that the university itself can become a plantation for a lot of us, where we're keeping our heads down and doing what we're told. We're keeping time according to metrics of timekeeping that have nothing to do with what really matters, and everything to do with keeping us in order and keeping us in control. And so much of what I love about being part of the academy is being part of a space that's emergent, that is co-created, that's about realizing the needs of the people who are in the room, rather than being nostalgic for some kind of indoctrination that worked a generation ago, right? What is the knowledge that we need to get free right now? How are we centering it in our campuses, in our classrooms, in our curricula, and how are we focusing on it in ways that are in tune with what's happening in the moment? In order to be able to do that, that means that we have to be in tune with ourselves. We have to do our own work. So many of the faculty at the school that I am working in did not respond to the 2016 election, right? The election happened the next day. It was either class as usual, we're not interrupting the curriculum, or folks just canceled. The student said that mine was one of the few places where we actually processed. And I thought, I wonder why that is. And as I talked to my peers, what I found is that the majority of people were so in their own feelings that they actually couldn't stop, center, make room, create space for a different kind of conversation that includes, broadens into relationship with those around you, instead of collapsing into a pit of despair, right? One of the things that Reverend Angel says often is a quote from Bruce Lee, and so I'll read it here. In the face of challenge, we do not rise to our aspirations. We fall to the level of our practice. It's a good one. It's a good one. I wrote it down after hearing it 10 times. It took a while. We don't rise to our aspirations. We don't do what we hope to do. We don't do what we plan to do. We do what we've been practicing. And if what we've been practicing, in terms of a practice of keeping time or telling time, is making the mark, or not falling behind, or outpacing everyone else, then more likely than not, we're going to collapse in on ourselves and miss an opportunity to connect, to shift, to make a different choice, to be vulnerable in a space where we already feel so taxed. And it's incredible to me how much can change. So the entire curriculum changed, right? Instead of full steam ahead with the curriculum as usual, when the 2016 elections came, I was like, okay, for this intro to sociology class, I think we're gonna need to take at least a week to focus on whiteness. What is the social construction of whiteness? And then this throws the students off, because then they think they're talking about, I'm talking about white people. I'm like, no, how do you know you're white? Because of my skin color? Your skin isn't white. Because people tell me? Right. Oh, right. It's a social construction. And once you start peeling back the layers of what you've been told and what you've invested in order to belong, you start to see, I didn't actually sign up for all of these things. I'm actually not completely comfortable with all of these things. As a brown-bodied, black-identified person, noticing how implicated I was in what George Lipschitz calls the possessive investments of whiteness, did not take a class, did not take an anti-racism training. It took a cushion. And it took sitting with myself long enough to feel the rage that I was repressing in order to belong to institutions of higher education that were predominantly white. And I'd been living in predominantly white spaces since I was 12, which is before you even have a sense of who you are. So you're just like, I'm just trying to become the best me I can be. I'm learning from my teachers, but my teachers were telling me things like, you're not going to get into an Ivy League school. I don't even know why you're applying. They were telling me things like, inadvertently, right, that you don't belong here, and that you're going to have to work so much harder to prove that you belong here than anyone else. These were teachers telling me things, and when I think of my spiritual teachers, I used to just think of like, who taught me how to be accountable to my practice? But as I get older and more seasoned in my practice, I'm realizing everyone was a teacher. And I was internalizing these messages as if they were Dharma, as if they were gospel, as if they were truth, as if they were law, because I didn't know what else to look to, right? And so having that internal practice of discernment that started on the cushion and started with rage, to be honest with you, right, became its own teacher. And making time, paying attention, tending to that, taking refuge in that, even if it felt scary, uncomfortable, messy, inconvenient, has transformed my ability to hold space like that for others. And so part of what we do in the classroom is center. And I don't call it center, I just call it check-in. And if we have enough time to actually do that practice, what happens is that it starts at this kind of surface level, and inevitably, with every check-in, it descends in a cycle, not a teleology. We start to, not a teleology of ascent, but kind of a deepening into truth. And part of what I love about that is the resonance between each speaker, who gets a little bit more comfortable sharing a little bit more of themselves with every pass. The conditioning that our students are in is wreaking havoc on their ability to tell time for themselves, which means when they get confronted with issues of racial injustice, issues of heterosexism, issues of ableism, what they're reaching for is the right thing to say. What they're reaching for is what they're supposed to say, what they won't get in trouble or policed for saying. They're not reaching in. They're not centering and speaking from the heart. And that's our fault, because what we've been doing is training them to respond to real-time conflicts in axiomatic ways, in ways that are about scripts, in ways that are about, this is the politically correct thing to say, this is the way that you're supposed to, this is your place as a white person, your anger is righteous. Like, there are so many preconditioned embodiments of engagement with white supremacy. And all of them are inauthentic most of the time with what's happening in real time at the moment. And it might mean that we have to actually confront each other when we drop in and stop centering into that. Perfect, thanks. I was like, where are we in the time? All this conversation about time, I could just talk forever. Okay, 10 minutes, perfect. Because I want to make sure that there's time to ask questions. But part of what we're really working on in Radical Dharma is to get folks to use contemplative practice approaches to embodied practices, to enacting a liberatory path in order to speak and act as prophets, but not because you think your way is the only way, because we know that if you don't articulate your vision, and if we don't make room for it, we won't all get there together. There has to be a collective process. And so those are the 5. It's contemplative approach, embodied practice, liberatory path, prophetic praxis, collective process. And a lot of times the things that we focus on as educators when we're trying to incorporate contemplative approaches is really literal. We'll do like a minute meditation before class, or, incorporate movement, or it usually it includes like a mat or a cushion or a solitary space. Let me tell you, the Koch brothers have given how much money to this movement of self-care and contemplative practice? Because it produces isolated, island-like individuals who are all maintaining themselves without broadening into relationship and daring to be in confrontation with others, right? We don't need more disciplined students. We need more whole and healing people. Thanks. So contemplative approaches doesn't just have to be meditation, right? It's storytelling. One of the practices that we do in Radical Dharma spaces is, and don't try this at home, it requires a whole setup, right? But is to have people associate into the first time they experience racialization. And we're not talking about like the first time you noticed that people have different colors, right? And we're not even talking about the first time someone was racist, right? But the first time you realized your own racialization, that your own race mattered, right? Sometimes it's a positive experience, sometimes it's a negative experience, but the point is to like really sink into that moment, and then we make people engage in that process in telling the story in present tense. So instead of saying, when I was in kindergarten, this little girl, da-da-da-da-da, right? I'm 6. I'm in kindergarten. We're in the hallway. The lights are fluorescent and bright. There's no one else around. All of a sudden, you start to remember details that you wouldn't have remembered before. And in associating back into that moment, you're able to bring all the tools that you've gained since that time to that space and begin to heal backwards. What would that child have needed, or that adult? Some of us were adults from the first time we experienced racialization, right? How do we begin to address those wounds in real time as if they were happening now, but with the tools that we've gained since then? Yeah, 5 minutes? Oh, that wasn't the question. Right? So storytelling, journaling, creating spaces for people to drop into a different kind of earnestness. Instead of performing storytelling, there are spaces for us to drop the performance and speak as if we're speaking to ourselves, but being witnessed at the same time. Embodied practices don't just have to be religious, right? There's all different kinds of ways to begin to peel back an understanding of what time it is and create space for something quite miraculous. And so there are a bunch of other notes and things that I had to say. Let me see if there's anything real quick. We have to do. Okay, so yes, so right. So for those of you who don't know, Radical Dharma is a book that combines testimony, narrative, social analysis, and difficult conversation to seed a way out of the obvious stories we tell ourselves about race, love, and liberation. It asks how we can transform the times that we live in from one about fixing ourselves to belong to one of mutual respect and support for one another's thriving. An important lesson that I've learned is that we have to disarm in order to discern, in order to decide, or we will become a part of the very thing that we sought out to fight against. Freedom is a practice. Liberation is a choice. If we're not practicing what really matters, we are being told how to tell time by those that we say we're not interested in supporting. And so I look forward to hearing any questions that you might have and having a longer conversation if we can. So thank you all so much. Very generous. Thank you.
So we've got
Right.
mics, and thank you for raising your hand so I can come find you.
Oh, yes. Good.
Hello, Jasmine. My name is Nasib, she, her, hers. Thank you so much. Your prose really reminded me of Sarah Ahmed, which is meant to be a compliment. And so, I really appreciate this. I think this is the first time as an educator, but also as a learner, someone centered time in a non-assenting way. For someone like me who's been raised in traditions of reincarnation and recognizing karma that I might not know, right? Responsible for. So when you talked about responsibility, it can be limited when we see time in a linear way or an assenting way, and so we deflect from that responsibility. I was raised thinking that there's some things I won't be able to explain, but I have karma and I have responsibility to engage, right? Whether it's land that I am settling upon or space that I'm taking. So anyways, a lot of my learning as an educator, being socialized, like you've said, or conditioned, has been learning about ascension, right? Or how time is linearly modeled, especially from a Christian hegemonic perspective. And so this is how I've started to really do work with students, so I'm translatable to them, rather than thinking about how to engage my sense of time, or what I grew up and what I go back into, like spaces at home, or even back home in India. So I'm wondering, how do you engage folks? Because you said it shouldn't be like this is the right way, right? But how do I learn what I've kind of opted out of, or unlearn what I've opted out of in learning about time in a linear way? Like, how do you engage folks who think of time in strict linear ways and yet still make space for your voice and your sense of time? I mean, I know you did this quite beautifully now, but yeah, just wondering, in an educational space, how do you keep from your idea of Dharma from being kind of pushed back upon?
Colonized, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for the question and the appreciations. I think there's a few steps. One is that I have to notice when my own pacing is not decolonized yet, right? When am I kind of packing too much into the class, packing too much into the readings, the syllabus, so that there is no time for emergence, right? So part of the responsibility, I think when I get pushback, that's actually an indication that I've packed too much into the class itself. And so there isn't actually time to have an embodied reaction to it. And so part of what I see as pushback, that's just a mirror saying, we all need to slow down right now. Some of it is seasonal, right? In this moment of the time change and winter coming, there's a kind of kinetic anxiety that I've been noticing just in the last week. And the reading that we have on deck for next week is heavy lifting. So, and we've been weighing in on Angela Davis and Asada Shakur's narratives this week and last week. And so I was like, you know what? You haven't finished the reading. I need to sit with this for some more time. Why don't we just make an adjustment in the schedule and create more space? Because at the end of the day, the breakneck pace, getting it all in, is only going to lead to reinforcing the idea that I'm not enough. There's not enough time. I'm never going to match up. And that is not the notion or the story that I want to reinforce in my students. I also want to dispel them of this notion of having to get it right before they can speak, or only needing to say something that is, in their minds perfect before they can speak. I need us to be able to think out loud. The kinds of narratives and texts and questions that we're working with in class have no right answer. We haven't not figured this out. I'm not up here because I figured it out and I'm just waiting for you all to take the test. And no, this is a co-created process. And I'm hoping that the next generation, I can arm you with enough discernment and critical thinking so you can go out in the world and make real choices instead of scripted ones. Make real interventions instead of predicted ones, right? So having enough room in the classroom for improvisation, for responding to things as they are, without letting it go. I let that go really far my first couple years and reined it back in, but don't change the syllabus 3 times. That's what I learned. But once for the election is okay. But yeah, just having a sense of pacing that's in tune with them and it's in tune with the times really makes for a different kind of learning experience. And that's contemplative too, because we're just watching. We're just watching ourselves be incredibly tenacious and overachieving. I think one of the hardest things about, and I'm a junior person, right? So my first year in the tenure track, I was a VAP before this, a visiting assistant professor. I taught as a graduate student. But coming out of grad school with so many ideas and so many thoughts and so much to digest, I wanted to throw it all back at them right away. And it was like a desperate, urgent need. And just in the last year, I've been beginning to bring my contemplative practice and approach to my teaching and just say, okay, you don't have to get it all in. You don't have to share everything at once in order to have an impact, in order to seed the change that you want to see in the students. And if what you really want to seed is for them to slow down, drop in, and listen, then you better believe you have to practice that. Because they notice the things that you do more than the things that you say. Thank you for the question. Are folks practicing different kinds of interventions of pacing and improvisation in classes now? I see some heads nodding. Any challenges with how that's going, or things that people want to share? Yeah.
Hi again. If no one has any questions, I'll go, if that's okay. Okay, so I've been thinking a lot about how, like, as a queer trans person, trying to find a sangha that is inclusive is really challenging. And that means, or even trying to find a teacher, right? So finding a sangha is challenging also because I'm trying to understand how to work with conflict within the sangha in a way that includes abolitionist thinking, in a way that doesn't like promote the toxic way we perpetuate systems of like, what does it mean to hold your community accountable? In a way that like doesn't cancel people out. I know like if people can admit harm, they can work towards preventing that, but if they don't, you sort of have to decide whether to include someone and let them harm other people, or push them out of the community and let them figure out on their own. And it makes me think about like how horses deal with like other horses who don't behave. Like you kick them out and they have to survive. And I don't like that. And I'm wondering if you have any tips around that.
Yeah, it's the problem. You have named the problem of our movements today, is that we only know how to work with our friends. And if our friends fail us, we don't know how to work with them either, right? What happens when someone doesn't show up? When they don't live up? When they don't keep up with their own ideals, with their own commitments, with their own values? What they said they were there for. This is actually the biggest problem of our movements right now. The only metric of accountability we have is incarceration, surveillance, policing, punishment, and disposability. Why? Because when faced with challenge, we don't ascend to our aspirations, we fall to our practice, and our practice is the prison industrial complex. So in order to begin to try something different, I'm beginning with myself. What are the ways that I create separation in myself such that I have no tolerance for particular aspects of that behavior in other people? Case in point, my teenage stepdaughter. She just got a text message this morning that her friend doesn't want her to sleep over at her house anymore, and there's very little reason for it, and it's really petty and mean. This is not the first time this friend has created this kind of injury to my stepdaughter. And yet she keeps going back. And both me and my partner are like, oh, we hate this so much because we do this too. So how do we begin to call people in, like before we get to the hard thing, before we get to the failed relationship, the injury, the harm? How do we call each other in when we see each other allowing ourselves to be harmed, right? How do we call each other in when we see each other burning out? How do we not just say, oh, well, good luck. That's not going to work out. I know how that goes. But have that difficult conversation. I've had people give so much pushback, and these are long conversations. The problem is, right, that the prison industrial complex is a very quick, very efficient solution to a very complex problem. And the kind of solutions that we need to these very complex, convoluted problems take time, relationship, and patience. In most of the work that I've done with young people, it's just waiting it out. And I don't know, I don't have a perfect solution for how do we not cancel people, but I do believe that we have more empathy with one another when we're not dealing with each other as problems, but when we're dealing with each other as people. And so to the extent that people are available to it, having folks share their stories and keep their own accounts of what counts and creating space for the multiplicity of truths that are in the room can create the conditions of possibility for something else to happen other than canceling. But again, that takes time. And that also means that each one of us has to be deepened enough in our own practice that we can listen to somebody tell their version of the story that has nothing to do with our truth and not just freak out, not just fall apart. That's why we practice. That's why the contemplative approach matters. That's why the embodied approach matters. Because our physiological bodies respond to conflict way before our brains do. We can have all kinds of great intentions about being nice and equitable and consensus-based and da-da-da-da-da. But when the rubber hits the road, your body will lead you towards that place of contraction. And it will be your body that does not allow you to breathe into relationship. And if we can't train our bodies to respond differently to those moments of challenge, then we will fall to the thing that we've practiced: settler colonialism, prison industrial complex, white supremacy. And I want us to lose our chains. I want us to not be afraid. And I have to practice in order to get there. So thank you all for doing that work as well. And I look forward to being able to be in conversation with you all through this work as we move forward. Thank you so much.